give us your name and what year you were born, where you were born, a little bit about your background, your parents?
Well, my name is Michael Sayer, Sayer, born in Brooklyn, New York, but I haven't lived there most of my life. My father was a school teacher and a union organizer. He was a principal organizer in the development of the first rank and file teachers organization in New York City. Eventually became the United Federation of Teachers. My mother was a school teacher for 44 years. She taught elementary school and middle school. My father taught high school, social studies, economics. My sister was a music teacher, professor at Manhattan School of Music in New York, and she went to Ireland, did music there.
That's great. What were your parents' backgrounds? They were first generation or
Second,
second generation?
my father's family came from Russia. My mother's family came from Romania and Poland.
And
Both of them were born here.
do you think that had a big impact on how you viewed things in the United States at all?
They were Jewish, and that had a big impact on how I looked at the world. I was born in 1941. 1945, I was 4 years old, the end of the war. But 1946 or so, when I was about 5 years old, I became aware of the concentration camps. And I don't like the term Holocaust. I don't think it just wraps everybody up in a strange way. But the concentration camps were very important to me. I've always been, as a measure of what people are capable of doing to each other.
And you said that that was something that really struck you to the core, that you credit now in hindsight with really how you got involved in the civil rights movement, correct?
But it certainly affected how I viewed what I wanted to do with my life. As a teenager, I was very much interested in politics. Even as a child, I was interested in politics because my father was so into it every day. I remember in the seventh grade, I think it was, maybe it was the ninth grade, teacher, if I could make a presentation on UNICEF to the class. It didn't make any sense for me at that age to be doing that. But I felt, it's something that was important to me. Now, I was not an academic kid. Sports was my life. I wanted to be a baseball player, but I wasn't good enough. I wanted to be a basketball player, I wasn't tall enough. And I didn't want to be a football player because it was too rough. But I played all those sports, and day in and day out, I usually was the first one on the playground across the street and the last one to leave. I didn't like to read books till I got to college, actually.
So you were just talking about when you went to Harvard really early, and was that because of academics, even though you weren't bookish, or was that partially to do with sports, or how did that happen so early?
My father had his way. I would have graduated at 15. He graduated high school at 15, went to college. He went to Harvard too. Probably how I got in, because I was 113th in my class. I wasn't a top student. But I survived. I graduated with honors there. But again, my focus wasn't being a great student. My focus was on trying to understand the world around me and trying to figure out what the hell I was going to do with myself. Because I didn't have any conventional notions of what to do. I didn't want to be a corporate person. I didn't want to be a this or that. I think I was really into the notion of wanting to do something that was worthy of being a person. I don't know how to articulate that exactly.
Were you already you were staying involved in politics throughout college, or were you staying up to date with what was going on with the civil rights movement or getting involved in that?
Well, the civil rights movement really wasn't there in any visible way when I first started college in 1957. And I paid great attention to what was going on in the world, but I was very naive and very inexperienced. But I tried to understand it. I listened to other kids. I spoke my mind, probably more so than anybody wanted to hear it. I tended to have a peculiar trait, which is that I was willing to say things that other people weren't willing to say in a group session, like in a meeting in an organization. And I found that maverick role useful, helpful to people, because you'd look around the room, people were upset with something that was being said. Nobody wanted to deal with it. So nobody wanted to be the one, take the brunt of the reaction. That somehow didn't bother me. I don't know why. As long as it wasn't about me, I was okay. Which probably prepared me to be an attorney in the end, because I was always willing to work for other people and do things that I wouldn't do for myself.
So how did you first hear about SNCC? How did you learn about it?
My focus when I went south wasn't on SNCC. It was on getting there in the summer. Well, back up a step. For some reason that I don't know exactly, race was always an issue with me. I think it had to do with the fact that I was Jewish And I would look in the mirror and say, what's the difference between me and everybody else, and why do I have to be so careful or cautious or worried about what could happen? Because the anti-Semitism was still a big thing. Obviously today it is, but it was then too. And it was so close to the war that people were still very conscious of the vulnerability. Certainly in the Jewish community they were. And I was in New York, in Brooklyn, which a very big, I mean, my whole neighborhood was Jewish back in those days. Everybody in the building was Jewish. It was actually a pretty segregated situation. I later learned from being involved in a school desegregation case in New York when I was working for the Center for Constitutional Rights that my high school was the most gerrymandered, segregated high school in the city. Midwood High School. It was an entirely Jewish school, except for about a handful of kids. We had 4,000 kids in the school. I bet you there weren't more than 25 kids who weren't Jewish. It was all part of the design. It was mortifying for me to think that I was going to a segregated school, but it was a very high-performing school, and they wanted to keep it that way, and so they engineered the district that way.
Mhm. And so let's get back to kind of how you came to Mississippi to begin with. So you came down for Freedom Summer?
I came down in my junior year. I did an independent study with Professor Dorothy Lee, who was an anthropologist in race. And she had me read 32 autobiographies by Black leaders, where the focus was on what their story was and how they looked at the world, as opposed to reading about them by others writing stories about them, which was not representing their view, was representing the way the writer had sifted the information and concluded in writing their view of this person's life. She thought that was a very unfortunate way to learn about other people. So it wasn't important whether they were telling the truth or not about what happened. It's important that that's what they thought. They wanted everybody to understand. And so it's not the individual story itself, it's the collective learning that you get from reading all of these stories from people, because there are themes that emerge, the ways of looking at the world that emerge. There's a way of understanding how to listen to people that I profited from that. And she was a wonderful teacher. I talked with her about not coming back to school and finishing because I wanted to get involved in the movement. And she urged me to finish because it'll be so much harder later, she said, to finish. I said, but suppose the movement isn't there when I finish. She said, it'll be there, don't worry about it. You know, what did I know, right? So I went to Atlanta in the summer at Atlanta University, took a course in Black history, and that was my vehicle down there. I then found the local civil rights organization, the Committee on Appeal for Human Rights, and I worked with them for the summer. Lonnie King was the leader of that group. I also ran into Julian Bond, who was very supportive of the group. And Julian and I became friends, and he was really a mentor to me. I think he was really amused at teaching this white kid from Brooklyn who didn't know stuff from beans, you know, all the stuff. You could tell me anything and I'd believe him at that point. But he was also really a good guy. I enjoyed his poetry. We talked a lot about stuff. And because I had such an interest in politics, I was able to converse, I think, in ways that brought something to the table. I had good questions. I didn't necessarily have any answers, but they knew I was interested and I was real. Now, that didn't prevent me from getting into trouble with people.
And so is this, I'm sorry, this is 1961 that you went down, or?
Yes.
Okay.
61 was my first summer there. Went back in 62, having graduated. 62, I had a job with the Atlanta Journal as an intern, and I was hoping to stay on, but of course they couldn't let me stay on because I was so identified locally by the cops with the SNCC at that point and Committee on Appeal that they wouldn't have dared keep me. But they were gracious enough to let me finish the summer. I actually turned out to be a pretty good writer, and the city editor took me aside and said, you know, you could have a great career. You should look at the certain chain of newspapers in California and in Florida, getting me conveniently out of the way of Georgia and the Deep South.
So in Atlanta, were you living in an area that was mostly Black people, or were you staying in the white part of town and coming over for these things, or how did that work?
Well, the first summer I was, of course, at Atlanta University, which is entirely Black. One of 6 schools there, you know, in the complex.
And you stayed on campus. You lived on campus.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I had no money. I mean, I had enough money to get down there and back, so to speak. And the second summer, I was staying at a place that was free. This guy let students stay in his apartments until he found out I wasn't a student anymore. Then he kicked me out. but I was there for several months. I was in the white part of town, but it was free.
Did you get harassed by the police there?
No. The time I ran into trouble with police in the first 2 summers was in October of '62, when the Cuban Missile Crisis was on. I was working for United Press International. It was a Fair Play for Cuba committee demonstration to try to prevent the United States from engaging in a nuclear war with Russia over Cuba. And I was made to stand in front of a camera where they took my name and my place of employment. My place of employment, the UPI, was furious because, of course, the police told them immediately who I was and they were furious that I had told them on camera who I worked for because that embarrassed them. But I was going to leave there anyway.
So you came back down in '62 to take another class, and then you
No.
got the job. No, that was just the
'62
AJC.
came down to work for the Atlanta Journal.
Mm-hmm.
There was a great reporter and wonderful guy on the Atlanta Constitution, which was the sister paper to the Atlanta Journal, it was the morning paper. He was up at Harvard on a Neiman Fellowship, and he got me the job as an intern for the summer with the Journal. Now, I didn't know it was only a summer job, but apparently it was. The number of kids got the opportunity.
Was it specifically on a certain topic that you were supposed to cover, or was it everything?
Yeah, I was there a day, and they sent me out to interview Eleanor Roosevelt, who was at the airport.
Wow.
My first task, and I had a specific job to do, which was to get her to answer a question about a black kid who was on death row, a teenager, and the paper was working to try to save his life. And she was helping. So I go to the interview, and nobody's told me how to do anything right. And I get 2 questions in. I was the only person who got 2 questions. And I had a photographer there, and it wound up on the front page of the paper because it was Eleanor Roosevelt. And I got a byline out of it. And then my friend who was on the Constitution writes me a note, says, "Good work."
So despite having a good summer there and writing really well, you then found yourself trying to figure out what to do after the internship was over.
Well, I specifically was looking for a job on a newspaper.
Okay.
So with these details are coming back to me surely, but slowly. I had an interview at the Charlotte Observer and at United Press International. Both of them offered me a job. The Atlanta opportunity meant I could still be with all the people I knew. And so I took that job rather than the Charlotte Observer. Although the Charlotte Observer would have been a better experience, probably from the point of view of learning about newspaper work. I really wanted to do that more than anything else, which had never become second in my interest because I really wanted to work in the movement. Now, that's a contradiction in circumstance. You can't do both at the time. Really couldn't. Safely, not logically, and not honestly. Charlotte Observer specifically asked me what I thought about all these people demonstrating and so forth. And I was prepared for the answer, and I said, I don't have any truck with that, which was an absolute lie to get the job, right?
Mm-hmm.
During the summer of '62, while I was working for the Journal, and then when I was working for UPI, I was living in an apartment in the Black community, which was the apartment of a guy named Jake Rosen and his wife, Wendy Nakashima. Now, these 2 folks, who were wonderful people and very nice to me and very helpful, were actually members of PL, which is Progressive Labor Party, PLP, which was a youth wing of the Communist Party of the United States, which I didn't know initially, but I soon learned. And the entire time I lived there, Jake was trying to train me to become right-thinking. He considered me to be sentimentally democratic, a liberal without the toughness that he thought I should have in a way of working that he thought I should do. Mm-hmm. I listened very carefully to him and very patiently. He never won me over, unfortunately, from his point of view. So I did go with him up to Monroe, North Carolina, where he was working. But in Monroe, it became clear the question arose about how decisions would be made. So he described democratic centralism to me. I said, from what I understand, then I can't win any of these discussions. I've got to do what you all decide I have to do on the grounds that the majority decided that. I don't have the right to an independent notion of where to draw the line. He said, that's right. I said, well, I'm leaving. And I left because I knew that this was not a game that I wanted to play with him. But Jake was very smart and a very cool guy. I liked him a lot, but I didn't trust him. And then he did something really snarky from my point of view. When I was working for SNCC in Jackson in the summer of '64, he had gotten people like Staunton Lind and John Lewis to agree to be on the board of a newspaper, a new weekly that they were going to put out, bringing the news of the movement to the people, right? And he sent thousands of copies of the first issue to the office, COFO office in Jackson. Well, first place, the entire paper was printed in red ink. And secondly, the content was clearly politically. Now, I wouldn't care if it were not Mississippi. This is 1960s Mississippi. Things were tough enough without being labeled. The red baiting was still alive and well. SNCC was very effective in fighting it because it refused to listen to people who said, so-and-so's in the commission and so on, because some of our people were. And SNCC said, we don't care. That broke the back of the red baiting, as a matter of fact, politically, not only in Mississippi, but everywhere. Just ignore it. Say, go to hell. Our test was, are you willing to work? That was Bob Moses' notion, which was, if you're willing to work, in these situations, we'll accept your work. We don't care what you believe or where you're from or who you are and so forth. Now, SCLC didn't take that position, and they got rid of some of their best people, or separated them out and created distance between King and them over the issue of red baiting. Jack Odell was a famous example of that.
So how did you end up getting into SNCC though? We missed that connection because you jumped into being in SNCC, but how did you actually get in there?
Just to finish up 62's chain, because it links into this, how I got to SNCC. Ella Baker, Jim Foreman, and Bob Moses sat with me one day and asked me to take on a job that needed to be done because I had a background in journalism, which was to set up a communication mechanism out of the NSA office in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which NSA had agreed to allow SNCC to do. And we were going to pump out the information about who was getting jailed, who was getting shot at, who was getting killed, whose churches were getting burned, and so forth, all over the South. Because there was really a dearth of information coming out. They rightly felt that publicity was a key element in developing protection for people, or enabling people to understand what was going on as well. Two functions. One, save the individuals involved or prevent stuff from happening, and then building an understanding of what the struggle was really about. But also third element is to put pressure on the federal government to act. And we had communication with the White House and with the Justice Department and so forth. It was hard to get them to act without there being a basis for understanding what's going on, right? Because there was a lot of counter pressure. After all, the Congress was controlled by the Southern Democrats. They had all the chairs that they needed to control things. So I spent a week on the road. I didn't sleep the whole time. I was working with Peter Countryman out of the Northern Student Movement in Connecticut. We're trying to set it up with him. And then I got ill. I developed benign viral pericarditis. And I was out of it for about 6 or 7 months until the spring of '63. At that point, best friend from college came back from Japan, where he'd spent a year on a fellowship. And he was going to Columbia to train as an architect. And so we got to talking about work and so forth. And he was my mentor in college in an organization called TOCSIN, TOCSIN, which was French for the bell they rang in the community to warn everybody of danger. And we were anti-nuclear weapons. And our big nemesis was Henry Kissinger, who was a professor. I had 2 courses with him. We sat in there and listened to him denounce us from the podium. But I really learned not to be afraid of these people, because I was with people who weren't afraid of them. Especially the seniors, insight and understanding. I was a freshman, then I was a sophomore, and so forth. I was still learning my way around how to survive the emotional chaos that comes from these confrontations. And so Bob and I somehow I talked Bob into coming down for the summer, or coming down, period, rather, not for the summer, and giving up Columbia. I don't know how I did that, but I did. And he came down to Atlanta with me, came back to Atlanta with me, and we both wound up working for SNCC. But prior to getting on SNCC's staff, we spent the summer making a fight on behalf of the workers at the airport. All Black workers doing the janitorial work and the mechanics work, keeping everything going. the time Atlanta was a small airport.
You were working for the airport. It was the big strike, right, at the Atlanta airport.
Yeah, so the strike really threatened to shut the whole thing down. Our theme was Atlanta, a haven for white business, hell for black workers. We had huge signs that all the workers helped make. And Marshall Race, who was the union president, came down to break the strike. We had a big confrontational meeting in which I spoke. Bob said he'd never heard me like that before. I said I couldn't remember a thing I said. I spoke twice to thunderous applause. My opponent, who was a black guy that nobody knew, but Marshall Race brought with him, spoke. He got thunderous applause. Phenomenon, which I later came to understand. But in the end, they red baited me, and there was no justification in it. It didn't matter. So people got nervous. They were threatened by the boss. They're threatened by the boss of the union. And if the union was against them and the management was against them, very hard for them to stand up to it. The other thing that perhaps ought to be said about in terms of my education was that during the time that I was ill with benign viral pericarditis, I stayed in my family home in Brooklyn, and I ventured out against the wishes of my doctor, meet people in New York City who were doing stuff. So I ran into a guy named Tom Hayden, the beginnings of SDS, Students for Democratic Society, which grew out of SLID, Leadership Independent. I can't remember what SLID stand for, but it was the precursor. Tom and I became friends, and I got invited to go to Ann Arbor by car to a national annual meeting of the group. The SDS was just getting started. I got to meet all those people and listen to all the discussion, watch how they played, both politically and personally. And I came away shaking my head. The discussions were sometimes erudite, sometimes politically nasty, but they were pointless. People were just, if I can use the technical legal jargon, they were fucking with each other for the fun of it. And they were laughing afterwards about how they got so and so all messed up and so on. And there were factions. Some people had different targets. Thought it was a monumental waste of my time. But I liked the people involved. So I met Casey Hayden before she was Casey Hayden. And a lot of the kids from Ann Arbor, a lot of the leadership came from that area. Tom Hayden went to Michigan as a student. He was a newspaper editor there. And Tom made a name for himself by going down to Macomb, Mississippi in 61 and getting beaten. Left, went away, wrote about it. He was always resented by SNCC folks, and SDS was resented by SNCC folks. They felt that SDS was really a bunch of wealthy college kids who saw the work in the South as being irrelevant to their approach to stuff and so forth. And there's never a good feeling between them. It's just an aside, but
Right, and they come down and stir up trouble and then get to leave to the safety of their own homes, right?
yeah, well, I had two examples of what the problem was. In 1969, the leadership with the Weathermen was really RIM 1, Revolutionary Youth Movement 1, was an SDS faction. And there was RIM 2, and then there was the old SDS, as they call themselves, or the regular SDS. It split into three factions. And Arthur Kanoy, who was a mentor of mine at law school, before law school and at law school, who I worked for, did a workshop together with the RIM 1. Part of that workshop was a presentation by me about the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and what created it, what it accomplished, in the context of the movement in terms of developing. We use that as a way of describing getting into the whole business of strategy and tactics and vision. At the end of the workshop, basically, I was stunned by the reaction of the group. They were all there. Basically, I can sum it up by saying the reaction was, who cares what happened in 1965? That's old history. That's ancient history, was the term they used. 4 years ago was ancient history to them. And they had no interest at all, really, in pursuing and understanding what transpired in Mississippi as a basis for understanding the world they were in. It was just disappointing. I didn't take it personally. I said, what the hell's going on here? The second thing was that in 69, you had the Chicago 8 trial, which is the first case I was involved with at a law school.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I didn't start small. And I asked to be involved with that. Kanoy couldn't travel because he had this terrible heart attack in 68 when he was working on the Adam Clayton Powell case. And so I became his arms and legs, literally. and he sent me all over the country, different thing, doing different things, and I'd be on the phone with him basically every few hours to check in and say, this is what's happened, this is what I've done, this is what you asked me to do, and so forth, and then, what do you want me to do now? And he would struck me, and I was like a long distance marionette, but I was good at it for some reason. I was able to do it. We understood each other. You didn't have to explain stuff to me twice. Bernadine Dorn, I'm sure you know that name. She calls up Arthur and she's crying and she's scared to death because the Panthers in Chicago, Fred Hampton, said that if they attacked the federal building where Bobby Seale was held in jail without bail during the Chicago 8 trial, that they'd kill him. Now, they were planning 3 days of rage, it was called, right? Days of rage. They were going to go downtown, they were going to tear up, right? They were going to vandalize everything. We didn't want him to touch the court because Fred did not want anything to jeopardize Bobby's situation because they were trying to pin a murder on him. And he didn't want negative publicity about his attitude. He wanted Bobby Seale to be able to speak for himself. But Bobby had no business being in the Chicago 8 trial. It was totally a fabrication on the government's part. So they had reason to believe that if anything happened at the federal courthouse, they would try to use it against Seale, right? So Arthur calls me, says I got to come back to New York right away. So I get on a plane, I go back, and he explains the situation to me. And he gives me these instructions. He says, you got to negotiate an agreement among the 3 factions of SDS, Rim 1, Rim 2, and the regulars, so that they can negotiate an agreement with the Panthers in which the Panthers will agree not to kill them. They can do the days of rage and leave the federal court alone. The problem was I didn't know anybody in any of the 3 organizations or the Panthers either. Well, I saw Fred Hampton almost every night at our strategy sessions, but we were on talking terms. I mean, I don't know if he knew me or not. He might have recognized my face, but I didn't say anything in these meetings, and we never got introduced to each other in any formal sense. So here's a person who's never done this before, doesn't know anybody he's going to be meeting. He knows of them, but doesn't really know them. They don't know him. And I've got 3 days to negotiate a settlement. If anybody else had asked me to do that, I would have said no. It's got to be crazy. Arthur said, you can do this. I don't know why he thought I could do this, but he had no choice because he couldn't do it himself because he was physically unable to do that. Mm-hmm. And we knew his phone was tapped. We couldn't have this discussion on the phone. I didn't know why I was coming back initially. And he didn't explain that to me either. The reason we knew his phone was tapped was that one day he was on the phone talking and he heard suddenly there were 2 generals, United States Army, talking to each other about tickets for the Army-Navy game. You listen for a minute, then he decided to hang up. He didn't want to know anymore than that. We knew that our phones were tapped in Mississippi because one day I was on the phone, long conversation, somebody, when I was in Hattiesburg, at the Black Hotel we stayed at, and I hung up and I walk away, the phone rings. It was close, so I answered it. I listened to the last 30 seconds of my phone conversation that I just finished with somebody else. So we knew that was tapped. We had every reason to believe it anyway. We knew that they had people inside our organization probably who were working for them. I go back to Chicago and he gave me the names of the people to reach out to in each of these organizations. I had my wife with me and my dog. Why did I have my wife with me and my dog? Because we knew that the 3 organizations were paranoid about the FBI. And that even though I said I was Arthur Kanoy, which was a password practically in those days, Arthur was revered by everybody in the movement. Regardless of whether they liked each other or not, they revered Kanoy because he was a great attorney, help people understand where they're at. So I figured I've got to do something nobody would ever accuse an FBI guy of traveling with a dog or his wife. I mean, you could tell the FBI guys, we would go up to the FBI and say, how do you know? I said, because you look at your hat, your tie, your jacket, you guys look alike. And they wouldn't even frown at that point. They just the same look, dead look, right? First I got somebody from the regulars to say they would agree. The others agreed. Then I went to Rim 2 and got them to agree. And then the last one was Rim 1. It wasn't easy. I had to figure out what it is that people could hear from me to build trust enough in me that they didn't know to believe that it would work. Well, I had to build a couple of lies in there and tell people that the other groups had already agreed to it, which is a lie. I've never told the story quite this way, admitting to these lies that I had to do. I was being manipulative, obviously. I don't know where I learned the skill to do that. I had no training in it. I think I probably had a good sense of how to listen to people, how to draw them out, and had to find the place where I could make a move for common ground. I didn't need a lot of common ground, but I needed some. I couldn't convince them that so and so was not as bad as they were, and they hated each other, And I couldn't get in the middle of that. If I got in the middle of that, I would have been dead. I had to stay out of that realm, that part of the discussion, and I had to steer them away when they wanted to go there. They wanted me to sort of vindicate their view of the other teams, and I didn't dare do that. And I didn't know whether I could trust the person I was talking to. Well, there were vivid recollections of the ones with Rim One, the weather people, Bernadine Dorn. Bernadine Dorn asked to meet me at a restaurant in downtown Chicago, which was extremely busy at lunchtime. She figured that was the safest way to meet me. But I brought my wife and my dog. She openly attacked me for that. She said it was sexist of me to bring my wife. Really had no role to play in this thing. Of course, that was fine because then she could trust me that I wasn't FBI. But so we set it up with the help of Arthur, basically. Arthur's vouching for me was critical because Bernadine had told him in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So we go to her apartment. She and Jake Ayers were living together. I don't know if they were married at the time or not. But it was their entire leadership team, about 8 or 9 people, I think, maybe that many. Well, Benny, who was still sort of a super puppy and very ornery, disobedient, and lacking discipline, peed on their hardwood floors. Bernadine was furious. It's a hardwood floor. Your dog can't control it. And when my wife and I went outside, I leaned over and said, "Good dog, Benny. Good dog." I told the story to Liz Strout, who's a friend of mine. She's a novelist. They make movies out of her books and stuff. And she's married to a good friend of mine, Jim Tierney, who was an attorney general in Maine when I lived there. He's our next door neighbor. And anyway, I told the story to Liz, and she just cracked up. She said, "That's wonderful. That's perfect." Because my attitude was, they're worried about making revolution. She's worried about the hardwood floors being peed on.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How radical.
But that's why I tell that story to you because it seems to me to reflect the absurdity of it. Oh, there's a third story. I was telling Bernadine that I wasn't I wasn't the person she thought I was. I'm not a Marxist, I said. "I'm sorry, your reputation precedes you." Here's why they thought I was a Marxist. I was in a meeting of the National Lawyers Guild people and one of the people from Bernadine's organization was in that discussion. And I hadn't said anything much in the meeting till the end, and I made some comment about how in Mississippi we were exploiting the contradictions between the Constitution and the reality of what was going on. The phrase "exploiting the contradictions" is a common phrase used on the far left as Marxist jargon. All I had to do was drop a little Marxist jargon, and I did that in another meeting, and everybody thought, "Wow, this guy's he's one of us," So I told Kanoy, I said, "You know how easy it would be to infiltrate these groups? Crazy. They can't see beyond their own noses." I'm not trying to put anybody down here. I'm trying to explain how I got to thinking about stuff the way I did.
And how did that differ for you from what you lived through in Atlanta? And we'll get to Mississippi, but did you feel threatened in Atlanta? Did you ever worry about your safety or the safety of the people around you?
Atlanta was going out of its way to try to become the jewel of the South, in contrast to New Orleans, which was trying to hold on fast to the old ways. So the mayor, Ivan Allen, was a white guy. The white leadership was anxious for change, but like after slavery, not that much change. For example, when I was arrested for sitting in at Leb's restaurant along with a bunch of the police officer involved was really nice to us. He was a good guy. He thought we were right. Nothing he could do about it, but he treated us well. And although I spent a night in the city jail and county farm and the county jail and so forth, we weren't beaten or abused or whatever. We refused to work on the county farm, so we all wound up in solitary confinement, which wasn't solitary because they had 6 of us in this little box. And we couldn't all sit down at the same time. It wasn't like Mississippi. It wasn't like Parchment for people there. Parchment Penitentiary was really brutal. And they went out of their way to be abusive toward the kids. Including, we're all kids, right?
Oh, I had no idea that part of your life existed at all. That's so interesting that you had that kind of that on top of all of the civil rights stuff. Let's go back a little bit and get into some more of the SNCC. I guess we probably ended off in 63 when you were
So 63, we tried to get SNCC involved in the fight around the airport. SNCC finally sent Ivanhoe Donaldson. He spoke at one of the meetings. But SNCC was really sneering at us. We weren't doing it right. We weren't, why should they get involved? It was Atlanta. Nobody wants to get involved in their own hometown. Like SCLC didn't want to get involved either. But we forged ahead to the dismay of everybody, I guess, who was a professional organizer. I don't say that's disparagingly, but what did Bob and I know? We were just doing our thing, but we were very intense about it. We worked hard at it. We would have won that fight too if Marshall Race had been on our side. But head of the union had been on our side. But came August of '63, and I was hanging around SNCC a lot. Julian Bond was in charge because Foreman was out of town, and Julian offered me the job in communications, and I took it. So when Foreman came back a couple of weeks later, he was very unhappy that Julian had employed somebody without his permission, without consulting him. But Julian knew that if he had consulted him, he'd probably say no. So I joined Dottie Miller at the time, in communications. Later on, Mary King came on to communications. But I was also involved with research under Jack Menace. So Julian was one mentor, and Dottie was a mentor also to me. Well, more so than Julian, because I spent a lot of time with Dottie. Much more time with her than with Julian at that point, but also with Jack Menace, who was head of research, and Walt Tillow, who I mentioned before, and Rick Manning were my roommates, and they were involved directly with research as well as, I was on communications and research. They weren't writing the communication stuff or fielding it. Now, Rick Manning his father had been general counsel to DuPont Corporation, and when DuPont lost the antitrust case, had to divest General Motors, his father lost his job. He was a great kid. He wanted to go to Cuba after the revolution. This was 1963. It's just happening. His father was so fearful that if he went to Cuba, he would lose his job as general counsel. He stuffed his son at a mental institution in the Philadelphia area and had him held there for a year. When Rick got out, he came south directly, and we took him in. Walt and I took him into our apartment. So we had 3 people there instead of 2. And the apartment had belonged to Jake Rosen and Wendy Nakashima. Got sort of dicey when they came back, but we all lived there. In any event,
and that was, I'm sorry, where was that? Was that in Jackson or?
no, it was in Atlanta.
Oh, sorry, this is still in Atlanta. Okay.
Yeah. When I first worked for SNCC, I was working in Atlanta.
Okay. And then how did you end up in Mississippi? How did that happen?
Well, that resulted from a big fight between Foreman and Moses. 63, there was a governor's election as well as a legislative election. The strategy was on SNCC's part, not SNCC's part, Mississippi's part. All these operations were essentially independent of each other. It's a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the SNCC started out as an organization of different campuses, coordinating their activities, but operating independently of each other and helping each other out, but still being independent of each other. So Mississippi was really an experiment, not in a campus way, but in a community way under Bob Moses' leadership. It was different. And Southwest Georgia had become different, in the same way under the leadership of Charles Sherrod. So what was emerging was a way of doing business in SNCC that was separate and apart from the coordinating function of the campus representatives. And so in '63, Mississippi decided that they were going to experiment with bringing kids down from the North, particularly white kids from good colleges, as a way of creating protection for the work in Mississippi, because there was a fear in Mississippi that if they attacked these kids coming down, create a great deal of negative publicity for Mississippi and expose the way of life. Mm-hmm. On the one hand. On the other hand, we wanted to make sure that the kids had a personal experience that they could bring back to their communities that would be different than anything you could read about, hear about, or see on TV. And nothing was playing on TV anyway. TV was new to the situation. In fact, it was the civil rights movement that caused the TV networks to expand their nightly news from 15 minutes to 30 minutes. In terms of impact on the culture, it was enormous. And then, of course, the TV became a vehicle through which people later learned about the Vietnam War on a nightly basis. The technology had an impact. If we could get the reporters to understand what was going on, they would tell the story from their point of view, but nothing would be better than having kids go back to their hometowns and say, I saw it with my own eyes. You know me, you know my family, you know, we're important people in this town, right? Kind of thing. Wouldn't say it that way, but that would be the implication.
Mm-hmm.
So the focus was on Yale University and College of the Pacific in the West. Well, it's redundant, yeah, Pacific, right? So you had the two schools. Peter Countryman was involved in the Yale thing, and I don't remember who was involved in College of the Pacific. But the idea, the energy for the initiative came from Allard Lowenstein, who had been an aide to Senator Hubert Humphrey, and who had made a name for himself being involved in stuff in South Africa and other places. So Allard Lowenstein came down to Mississippi, talked with Bob and with Aaron Henry, who was head of the NAACP, so forth, and I traveled with them all. And Aaron Henry became the candidate in a freedom vote. What were we going to do? You couldn't get people to register to vote because people weren't being allowed to register to vote. It wasn't that they weren't trying, but we knew that they wouldn't get to vote. We needed to demonstrate, we needed a way to demonstrate that people wanted to vote, because the lie coming out of the white community was a lot of people didn't want to be involved in politics, which is why politics is white folks' business. Not why, but I mean, it was connected to that. How could we demonstrate that people wanted to vote? How could we give people the experience of voting who had never voted before? How could we get them used to going to a place to vote and understanding how to make out a ballot, how to understand what the issues were, where it was important, how to identify who to vote for as opposed to who not to vote for? And so, I mean, it's hard for people who have never been exposed to the situation to understand just how little connection to a system people had who lived in it every day, because it was dangerous to even acknowledge that you knew or that you aspired to become involved in it. So how could you create a collective process where people overcame the fear of being involved in it, even if they knew how to be involved in it, because their family could be killed or burned out, or he could get fired from his job and have no source of income, and so shit could happen. It was happening anyway. So how do you do that? So we invented this thing called the freedom vote, which was a mock election process, which 80,000 people participated. We created candidates, we created precinct meetings, county meetings, statewide meetings, and so forth. Went through the exact process that you would go through if you were doing the regular election.
Mm-hmm.
Then, having documented it as well as we could, and by the way, we invented a security system with the acquiescence of the phone company, in which every town had a name. And when a person was going to travel from point A to point B, we had to know where he's going, when he was going to get there. And within 15 minutes of the due time, he had to call in so we knew he got there safely. Mm-hmm. If not, we were going to institute our security follow-up, begin to make calls to find them. Sometimes people didn't get there, and we went through very strenuous efforts to find them. But you didn't play. You didn't do that right, just as a casual matter. You didn't get to go again. But the phone company, we couldn't afford to pay for these phone calls. We had to do a way to cheat, essentially, the system, so we could have the information without paying for it. What we did was people would call collect for so-and-so, and they would say they're from such and such calling, and that's how we knew that so-and-so got there, okay? Now, the phone company knew that that was going on, and they felt that that was cheating them out of there. They let us do it because Bob convinced them that it was the right thing to do in the circumstance.
Bob Moses convinced them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
By the way, of being very convincing in his quiet, charisma way. But the phone company later on in the year said, it's enough. You made your point. You can't do it free. That's when we got a new thing called the Watts line, wide area telephone service. So we could make these calls and know how much it was going to cost, because you didn't pay for the individual call, you paid for the service. It's an interesting facet in itself, the make do that we learned to do within the system, figuring out how to deal with the technologies and stuff. Same way with the cars. We didn't have cars, but we needed to have transportation. So the worked out contributions from people enough to buy a fleet of cars, used cars, of course. And then George Green, who was an ace mechanic, kind of guy who could fix anything, just made sure that everything was running. And he also taught people how to drive in ways that they could help avoid getting stopped or caught by the Klans guys on the highway. Bob took me with him to Washington, D.C. in November of '63 after the mock election for the purposes of our generating support from Congress. A, we had to get them to understand that people couldn't vote, couldn't register to vote or vote. B, that was critically important. C, that the country was aware of it and was not going to stand for it. People had a right as a United States citizen to vote. The states didn't have the right to deny that, which was still a controversial position to take. And that we had to have specific congressmen hold a press conference with us to demonstrate the report with one Republican and a Democrat. So we were focused on William Fitzryan, who was a Democrat from New York City, and a freshman congressman from Winnetka, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago, named Donald Rumsfeld.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Wow.
Who got it all? He was a good guy on this issue, right? Nobody thought of him as he was just an ordinary Republican, right? Freshman. We had that meeting. I remember talking to Rumsfeld the Friday before, no, excuse me, November 18th or 19th. It was a Friday, I think. Monday was the scheduled press conference. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, either the day of or the day before our conference was scheduled. We never had that press conference. It was all over. Meantime, the guy who wrote all these books, the president on the presidency, I can't remember his name, I can't remember how the titles went. Each president he wrote, Making a President kind of book. He writes 2 articles back to back in a weekly Look magazine.
Oh, Theodore White. Theodore White.
Yeah, that's right, Theodore White. And SNCC and CORE isolated out of the Big Five, the NAACP, the Urban League, SCLC, CORE and SNCC, as militant organizations that are working against the interests of the United States, which is understandable, but it was a direct attack from a very prominent, respected writer for the establishment, right? It's no coincidence. And it was bad stuff. We just, the same stuff that went on throughout American history. If you listen to the 1619 Project report, which I'm doing now on Audible, you could change the dates and have the information be current. That's neither here nor there right now. But anyway, so that ended our potential for out in the way we wanted to. So we went to stage 2, which was creating the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party as an alternative to the Mississippi Democratic Party, which was exclusively white. Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was designed to be a multiracial organization, which, while it might be against the law, nevertheless would give us the opportunity to demonstrate that we not only wanted to participate in politics, but we were open to working with whites and inviting whites in to do it. Now, we demonstrated that in the '63 election, having a white minister from Tougaloo College, Ed King, as the lieutenant governor candidate, with Aaron Henry being the black candidate for the governor. The fact that the black candidate was the governor and the white candidate was lieutenant governor was also symbolic of the fact that we were not going to defer on the basis of race to anybody. So the symbolism was important. Ed King was an activist, he's a good guy, well-liked. Aaron Henry was head of the NAACP, well-liked. Bob asked me to be his campaign manager. I told Bob I didn't know anything about that. He said, just go with him, don't worry about it. You need somebody to be there with him. So I was aide de camp rather than a campaign manager because Aaron Henry had his speech, he had the same speech every time, told the same jokes, and it really didn't matter what he was saying. It didn't matter what he was doing. They didn't need me, but I was just like a companion to be there so he didn't fall asleep driving, wasn't alone, because you didn't want him out on the road alone and so forth. The white people trusted me with these roles, I have no idea, but I learned from every one of them. They would ask me to speak publicly, I was terrified. You know what to say, what to do. But you do it enough, you get the comfort level, you're not scared of it anymore, kind of thing. I never stopped being scared of it. It took me 10 years probably not to be afraid of it. Not that I was fearful, but I didn't have a message that other people had. I don't think I did anyway. So the Freedom Democratic Party gets created as a vehicle. Now, this is where Bob came in to explain the theory of parallel organizations. It was very important to him and to us. I understood him on this, that people's expectations are critical to how you measure what constitutes success in the situation. FDP was not designed to be the answer to all issues or all problems, or to be the radical organization on the playing field. Bob explained a political organization. By definition, its success is in bringing as many people onto the playing field as possible. Well, if everybody has to agree first to everything involved, you have a very small group on the playing field, because it doesn't work that way in real life. The issue is, how do you find the common ground to bring as many people as possible to doing the objectives of that organization without making them give up everything that they otherwise believe in? Political organizations, he said, by definition, are conservative relative to the aspirations of those people who want the most change. So what else was on the playing field? Well, there was Council of Federated Organizations, which had been created in 62 or 63 as a coalition of SNCC, CORE, SCLC, and the NAACP. Now, Bob knew when we started that it was going to be a nightmare working with NAACP, not because of the local people, because of the national NAACP. And a leader in Memphis who was leaning very hard on Medgar Evers in Jackson, Mississippi, not to get involved in voting rights, not to get involved in demonstrations about voting rights and so forth. And Medgar went and did it anyway. But the national, we got a hold of correspondence between the guy in Memphis and the head of the NAACP nationally, whose name escapes me again for the moment, in which they talked about how to undermine the process and the importance of denouncing SNCC and CORE for their militancy, because the NAACP wanted to focus on litigation as a mechanism for change, because it was safer, but they weren't bringing litigation in Mississippi. And if they did, it wouldn't go anywhere anyway because of the federal judges, many of whom were appointed by Kennedy. And they were the worst judges of all, with Kennedy appointments. And Lyndon Johnson didn't help either with his appointments. The best judges were the Republican judges. Why? Because they were Republicans. Republicans in those days were mavericks, were not going along with the segregated system. Independence was appreciated by somebody like Eisenhower, who was a Republican, looking for Republicans to appoint. Kennedy needed the support of the chairman of the committees to get his legislative agenda done. The chairman were all Democrats from the South, almost exclusively, big segregationists. Where was he going to find candidates for judgeships that would be accepted or pushed by the senators? There was a system back then. You know, the senators had to approve who was, there still is a system really, in terms of how people get to be judges. So we had in Georgia and Alabama, Mississippi, so we had the worst judges, just terrible, district court judges. And some of them were personal friends of Kennedy, like Judge Cox in Jackson, who described the community people who were demonstrating at a courthouse for voting rights, as he said, as a dark cloud descending on the courthouse in the opinion that he wrote. It's crazy shit. Anyway, the Freedom Democratic Party, but what's it going to do? What's coming up in 64? 64, you had congressional elections. We had three women running for Fannie Lou Hamer, Victoria Gray, and Annie Devine in three different districts. Annie Devine was in Canton, Mississippi. Fannie Lou Hamer was in Ruleville, Mississippi. And Victoria Gray was in Hattiesburg. Now, the fact that they were women was very significant. They were leaders in their communities was significant. They were really trusted. They were fantastic people. You couldn't meet them and not love them. You know, they're just wonderful. They were so competent, so skillful. But that was part of it. The other part was the Democratic National Convention, 64 coming up. Now, that would have national attention in the way that the congressional races would not. The congressional races were an opportunity again for people to practice participating in the government system. Now, I don't think there was a mock election in 64, but there was an attempt to register and get people to vote. There may have been, but I don't remember if there was a mock election. The focus really was on the Democratic National Convention. How do you get to the Democratic National Convention in a way that enables everybody to understand what's going on and why it's important? That's where you have Freedom Summer coming in. Freedom Summer had a logic all its own in terms of assisting people with literacy and assisting people with voting rights. But the culmination was to bring all that together around the convention. This was not an easy process. SNCC was not of one mind on this. The national office was not happy under Foreman's leadership with what Mississippi was doing. Let me stop here a second. This is where you really need to see all of the different balloons involved. Do we have time to do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So you have the SNCC administration in Atlanta Mississippi Voting Rights Project in Mississippi. They're at each other's throats on this. In Mississippi, you have those who are supporting Summer Project, those who did not support it. Now, let me be clear. Those who were against the Summer Project, when the decision got made to go forward with it, were 100% in support of getting it done correctly and effectively, and their work reflected that. But up until the decision being made right near term to the beginning of it, it was touch and go. We had a week-long 8-day meeting, 7 or 8-day meeting at the Gammon Theological Center in Atlanta, which was fought out, and it was tough. And some people gained respect and some people lost respect in the process. But it also resulted in a transformation of SNCC decision-making process, because everybody was aware of how dangerous the summer was going to be, and that people were going to die maybe, and they wanted people wanted the right to say how they were going to live and how they were going to die. And they didn't want anybody imposing that on them. So there was independence on the part of SNCC staff in relation to the SNCC leadership in Mississippi, which was another area of division. And that was fought out in that 8-day meeting. And that's why the system of the people on the coordinating committee comprising the ultimate decision makers in SNCC collapsed. Because people in Mississippi said there's no way that somebody vaguely involved in the stuff, not really involved in work, but was on the coordinating committee, can decide for me whether or not I'm going to have a gun or not have a gun, whether or not I'm going to go here or go there, or what we're going to do. That's baloney. Bob was asking for SNCC to move its office to Mississippi for the summer, which was a direct challenge to the leadership of Foreman, who was, after all, administering from a base in Atlanta with the entire SNCC operation, Georgia and Arkansas and Mississippi and South Carolina, all the different places where work was going on, right? That battle was fought out in the basement in Atlanta of a restaurant that nobody knew where we were when we were there. Miss Baker sat in the middle of the floor. Well, it's not on the floor, she was in a chair, but she was between the Mississippi folks and the Atlanta folks. And Bob and Jim went at it. Bob basically said, we can't get the resources from SNCC, I'll get them from elsewhere, and we'll go out of SNCC. We'll go independent. Foreman was outraged at that and fought back, and the attacks got personal, if I recall correctly. Not vicious, but personal, in ways that people were so surprised that anybody would talk about Bob that way or about Jim that way, that it was painful to hear. It was also, there was consternation because nobody knew how to resolve this thing. I mean, both were making good arguments, but Bob's arguments were better than Jim's in terms of the urgency of the situation. So eventually, Bob prevailed. The office was moved for the summer. Bob made commitments to support, stay with SNCC, and to do what he could to be helpful in any other way, kind of thing. Now, Ms. Baker was instrumental just by her presence in keeping things safe, and she was master at enabling people to move their positions to generate a common ground and an answer. And probably there was out of respect for her. She was Mama in the culture, which respected Mama a great deal. She didn't play that card, but she didn't have to. Now, at the same time, SNCC in Southwest Georgia had very different models for work. Southwest Georgia focused on nonviolent direct action. Mississippi took the position that nonviolent direct action was a death sentence in Mississippi, and it couldn't work. And that voting, if people were going to die, they should die over something fundamental like voting, not die over a hamburger. Mm-hmm. That's oversimplifying the discussion, but it was a brutal discussion that took place in a very small room, and I can't remember what city we were in. It might have been Atlanta. It might have been in a hotel.
Were there other white members there, or were you the only one present for most of these conversations?
There were parts of this discussion, parts of this problem. Oscar Chase was somebody who was white. He was very, very effective. He appears in Howard Zinn's book on SNCC, his early book on SNCC. Oscar was there. Mike Miller was in and out. Mike should have been there, but I did a terrible thing when he came down from San Francisco. He drove down with a guy from the radio station. And I said, this needs to get to Holmes County tonight. Can you drive it? There was nobody else there, and I didn't have a driver's license. I couldn't drive. And I sent him out to Holmes County, and he got into a car accident. It was life-threatening, and he was laid up. He had to leave, go back to San Francisco. And I've never forgiven myself for that. And he doesn't remember it. I asked him about that years ago, and he says, I don't remember that.
Wow.
So he almost got killed. And I really learned something from having made that mistake. There may have been other white, well, there were certainly a lot of white folks. Yeah, I mean, a lot of women particularly Emmy Schrader, and I can't remember everybody's name. Certainly in the summer, there were a lot of white folks because that was the focus, was bringing kids from the North, most of whom were white. There were a few Black kids involved, but most
But
of
at
them
these high level communications, it's mainly just you and then sometimes Mike Miller or Oscar
Mike
Chase.
was never there when I was there.
Okay.
Mike was there before I was there with Dick Fry. Summer 62, the two white guys were Mike Miller and Dick Fry. Now, I got to go to Mississippi because Bob asked for me. And Jim was reluctant to let me go at that point. But it was part of Bob's ask. He needed somebody in communications and he wanted me to go. And I was quite anxious to go. So I got to go. That was in the summer 63. Not long after I got on SNCC staff, by the way. But the fight between Sherrod and Moses about how to fight this fight turned on this question of whether or not you could believe that white folks could change their minds and do the right thing. The Sherrod, who was a minister, took the position that if you did this well and you did it right, and you engaged in a spiritual struggle, that you could win them over. Well, I was absolutely insulated from that notion. I guess insulated might be an appropriate term here. He didn't believe that for a minute. He said, we've got to figure out how to make the system work, notwithstanding the reality that white folks are never going to voluntarily agree to do this. So it was about how do you, Bob said, if you look into the heart of Mississippi, you'll find the soul of America. Terrific insight at the time. What they're saying is that Mississippi is not different from the rest of the country. Mississippi is what the rest of the country is, except the Mississippi, they're more open about it, more obvious about it. It's an important position to take because the notion that the North was a haven was a total illusion, or that other parts of the South were better than Mississippi was an illusion. Mississippi had lynchings, but Mississippi isn't the only place that had lynchings. May have had more lynchings than other places, but, that's all just a matter of numbers at that point. So Bob took the position that we had to involve the country in Mississippi in order to get the country to recognize that this was where that this couldn't happen without the cooperation of the federal government and the state governments from around the country. They said no, it would end. They said if they acquiesced in it, it's why it exists. If they supported it, it's even worse. Truth is, the federal government was a major player in the segregation of the country under President Wilson. President Wilson was a Southern Democrat who was a racist dog who implemented segregation in the federal government that didn't exist prior to that point. So we knew we were up against the federal government as well as the state governments. Where do you go? Well, you go to the people, not as an abstraction, but as a real struggle. Because if people were where you needed them to be at, we wouldn't have had the problem in the first place. So how do you win the people over? Well, you've got to have some faith that there's a goodness in people, I guess, that if they have a chance to let it out, it'll come out. But it's not easy to do, and you got to be able to get people to do things that they don't want to do, even if they don't like to do it, because the opposite is unthinkable. And that was a tough struggle, and it still is, obviously. The premise was, how does SNCC resolve this difference in opinion? Vigorously fought out, not passively. There was real shouting going on there and anger. And Sherrod couldn't believe that Bob was saying what he was saying. Bob couldn't believe Sherrod. They believed it because they knew each other. But you know what I'm saying. SNCC did a marvelous thing. He said, we don't have to answer this question. But both sides play out their strategies and see what happens. That was the key to not having to decide this is the right way, that's the right way. Let the experience show. It showed successfully in both places. Performance analysis is you have to know what constitutes success. So it never desegregated a seat on a bus in Albany, Georgia. But the work there was so prominent nationally that it put segregation on the front burner. That was performance analysis, where they succeeded in Albany, even though they did not desegregate a single bus. A lot of people went to jail, and he said it was tremendous leverage that developed out of that. Now, Bob analysis was, well, they never won in Atlantic City. And in fact, SNCC's reaction to that was surprisingly negative and depressing. And people were despondent about the value of it. And Bob was party to that, which really surprised me. Because I thought that Atlantic City was a tremendous success. They didn't let me go. I had to go and guard the office in Jackson, the way I guarded the Atlanta office in '63 at the March on Washington. I never got to go to these things. Somebody had to be trusted to do that stuff, so I guess I was the guy. They established the right of Black people to say no in Atlantic City. They offered 2 seats and a solution that let all the white folks off the hook and would gain nothing for the black folks. They said no to it, even though all these prominent people were demanding it. President Johnson, Humphrey, so on, all these people. I thought that was a remarkable shift in the culture. The black folks could tell the most prominent white people in the world, most powerful people, no, Europa doesn't fly. Secondly, the Democrats changed forever their rules internally in terms of how the conventions ran. And everyone was embarrassed by the treatment of Fannie Lou Hamer in terms of what Johnson did in playing games. There's a lot there. You gotta understand what success means. What didn't come from that was a fervor and a belief in the political process. It should have been there. After all, this was the first crack at it. Why did you think you would? Part of the problem was people selling the idea that they could win, or that they were going to win. And that's where the expectations come in. I was surprised that Bob hadn't gotten control of that and let people's expectations of winning run away with it. And Bob felt so bad about it, he eventually left SNCC, went to Alabama, changed his name, eventually left the country and so forth. Well, there was a spin out from 64 National Convention. Freedom Summer was an immense success, right? People still trying to model it again. What went wrong? Several things happened that tilted the playing field. We had 1,000 young people from around the country, skilled, knowledgeable, strong-minded, strong-headed, strong-willed, relatively speaking, wealth compared to what Mississippi folks had and so forth.